When the Germans sent the Panther into World War II, it wasn't just a tank. It was an answer to everything the Soviets had. What it was supposed to be on paper was nothing like reality. Tanks were lost before reaching the front lines, crews were left stranded, and thousands would be abandoned by the time the war ended. But how did the Panther tank end up as one of the worst decisions ever made by the Germans? Before the Panther, the Germans greatly relied on the Panzer I and Panzer II tanks to blitz through opposing forces in Poland and France. Yet the Panzer III and IV tanks would join the onslaught for the Battle of France, proving too much for the Allies. It served the Wehrmacht well in their blitzkrieg efforts, allowing them to storm through most of Europe. However, conquering Europe alone was not the only thing Adolf Hitler had on his agenda. By 1941, the Führer had chosen a new target, one that would forever change the war. As Operation Barbarossa kicked into action, the Wehrmacht began marching on Moscow. As part of the invasion, the Germans heavily relied on the Panzer II and Panzer III tanks, which proved critical in the early days of the war. Yet facing the massive T-34 and faster KV-1 tanks would prove to be their biggest challenge. The new Soviet armor was stronger, faster, and mounted far bigger guns, leading to many Panzers II and III rounds simply bouncing off, leaving them exposed. It's only when the Panzer IV and its 75mm gun made its way to the battlefield that the Germans slowly began making ground. Moreover, the Flak 88 gun was in short supply, especially on the Eastern Front, and the need for something that could compete with the Soviet armor became even more apparent. The Germans couldn't wait, rushing the Panther to the battlefield, while crews had little to no training, and the tank itself was still untested, leading to incredible casualties. By 1943, the Panther was rushed to the Eastern Front as the only tank that could go toe-to-toe with the Soviet T-34. It featured an upgraded 75mm KWK-42 L-70 tank gun, supplemented by two 7.92mm MG 34 machine guns, and powered by a V12 Maybach HL 230p 30 petrol engine capable of pushing out 690 horsepower. It was a marvel in the factory and had the potential to be the greatest tank on the battlefield, but things didn't go as planned for the Wehrmacht. The first time the Panther saw combat would be during Operation Citadel, which also marked the start of the Battle of Kursk. Yet this would be the first time that Panther proved that it might not be as good as was initially speculated. Hundreds of Panthers were loaded onto trains, being transported to the front lines, but even after driving off the train, the first two Panthers would be lost. Two caught fire during the unloading process, burning down both tanks, while others often seized and simply broke down while en route to the front lines from the train station. For those tanks that did make it to the front lines, they'd face an even more devastating fate. While driving towards the Soviet positions, they came across a ditch filled with water. This was purposely designed to prevent tanks from moving forward, often forcing them to take a different, longer route. Many experienced operators quickly realized it was a trap, turning their Panther tanks around and going around the ditch. Unfortunately, some of the younger operators tried their luck, believing the powerful engine would allow them to quickly traverse the ditch. The only problem was that these ditches were packed with anti-tank mines. Once the tanks passed into the water, the mines were triggered, damaging the tracks and keeping them stuck in the mud. This was followed by Soviet artillery, raining down on them, wiping two Panther divisions off the battlefield before even firing a single shot. Even more frustrating was that those who did make it to the front line wouldn't even face the T-34 or KV-1 tanks. They were up against the M3 Lee sent via the United States Lend-Lease Act. These tanks quickly failed and had to retreat, proving that at least the Panther could hold its ground in tank combat. Their day quickly went from bad to worse when Soviet artillery pounded them, destroying 18 on the first day and 37 more on the second. Ironically, one of these tanks would be destroyed by one of its own Panzer IV, which mistook it for an enemy. Just this single battle left more than 200 Panthers out of action, with 130 of them permanently lost due to extensive damage. In just a single battle, and with no T-34s around, the Panther was already proving to be one of the worst German designs ever. But why? When the Panther was still being designed, Adolf Hitler himself had instructed how it should be built. On the sides, it features 40mm of armor, sloped at 40 degrees, with a lower skirt, unsloped, protecting it from anti-tank rifles. Yet Hitler ordered that the front be one of the most protected parts, leading to 80 millimeters of armor sloped at 55 degrees being put on the front. Even more clinical was the 100 millimeter of armor, sloped at 10 degrees, being used near the turret, which made it virtually impervious to anything the Soviets had. Unfortunately, this massive strength and defensive prowess came with a big drawback, one that largely contributed to the tank's unreliability on rugged terrain. The extra armor made it front-heavy, meaning that the tank was unbalanced, often being stuck in small pits and being unable to traverse the tough Soviet landscape. Many tanks were lost due to being unable to move when they got stuck, becoming sitting ducks for the Soviet tanks and artillery. What's even worse is the fact that these tanks were designed by German factory workers who often didn't agree with the war, leading to signs of sabotage being found on many of them. One example was finding loose screws that could have simply been due to poor workmanship, but the metal pieces found in the fuel tank and transmission that damaged the tank with each mile it moved forward proved near certain sabotage. The other major problem was the final drive, which serves as the final reduction stage in the drivetrain. These only had a lifespan of 160 miles, and with the Panther having a fuel range of 260 miles, it meant that the final drive needed to be replaced before the tank even ran out of fuel. More experienced drivers could manage this issue, but fixing it on the battlefield proved to be a big problem, completely immobilizing the tank for the time being. Then there were the engines that simply caught on fire like the first two to be sent into battle. This wasn't due to enemy attacks, but a bad mixture of fuel, which often failed to fully combust, dumping the leftovers on the hot exhaust, which immediately sent the tank into a fireball. Further compounding the design problems was the overlapping wheels, derived from the same suspension used in other German tanks. It allowed mud and debris to enter, often immobilizing the tank. This became incredibly bad when tank crews had to park overnight. Each morning, crews would need to clean the tracks, which made them vulnerable, and the Soviets eventually caught on, launching early morning attacks, while the Panther was stranded in the mud. Only about 5 out of 10 tanks would be able to go into combat each day, meaning a 50% combat readiness virtually destroyed any German hopes of having an overwhelming force. Fortunately, the Panther had the best gun of the war. With its 75mm gun, standing at 5 meters long, the Panther was definitely one of the most powerful weapons, and it could fire about 6 rounds per minute. More impressively, it could penetrate about 150 millimeters of armor, sloped at 30 degrees from more than 1 kilometer away. But this advantage didn't last long, especially when the Soviets found out that most of its shells were stored in the side sponson. The Soviets began targeting the sides of the Panther, and with each hit, it virtually blew up the entire tank. By the end of the war, most of the 6,000 Panther tanks that rolled off the production line were either destroyed or abandoned. But not before it nearly pulled off one of the most daring tactics in the war. Now, everyone enjoys fancy dresses or dressing up, but what Otto Skorzeny attempted in 1944 would blow the minds of even the CIA. The Germans needed to find a way to get behind the enemy lines, in a move to capture and destroy the Allied supplies. Otto Skorzeny would modify some of the Panther tanks, making them look like the American M10, while troops wore Allied uniforms and Allied guns. The plan almost worked, with the Germans trying to divide the Allies, Sau Division, and perhaps negotiate better terms for the end of the war. But having passed the first few checkpoints, they immediately stood out, with some parts being almost impossible to disguise. The Allies immediately jumped on them, destroying many while capturing the crew. It was a daring plan that could have worked, but unfortunately ended in another failure for the Panther. But the Panther was just one of many World War II tanks that proved to be failures. If you want to find out more, watch these videos on the T-34 and German Tiger II next.